and welcome back to another episode of Soccer Supernova with me, Amy CANAVAN, a state of mind's dedicated football chat show. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Richard McBrearty. Thank you so much for joining us, Richard. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Fantastic. I'm thoroughly looking forward to this one. This is going to be well up my street. I'm hoping towards like a history lesson. Then I'm well within my element. But before we get onto your role, which if anyone doesn't know is in the Scottish Football Museum at Hampden, I just wanted to first of all, your own sort of career in football. You had a little bit of a playing career yourself back in the day, didn't you?
Maybe not one to write home about, to be honest. But I tell you what, though, it kept me in good stead in coming into the museum. I was a kind of aspiring young player at youth level. I got to Scottish schools, but I got as far as Hamilton Accies reserves as a young student. I couldn't go any further than that. Although I really enjoyed my time there back in the early 1990s with Hamilton. Dropped into junior football after that, and then started working. And after I left university, and I started to peter out, went into amateurs. But the reason why I say that it kept me in good stead is that I was very lucky in 1999. When I was asked to interview for a research post at the Scottish Football Museum. It's before we'd even opened at Hampden. Hampden was just being redeveloped still at the time. The two things I had in my favour was I was a history graduate that had an interest in sport and the development of sport in Scotland from the Victorian period, which was good, but also I had a footballing background. So it's the one thing I say to people, somebody's going to say that, sticking at school as well as football. Well, sticking at football as well as school, because you never know what kind of job you might get if you're interested in the football industry.
Did the dream for football, was it always there? Was it a passion? Was the career wanting to be in football?
Yeah, I'd always wanted to. It's from a young age, like anything else. I always wanted to play football, and it's one of those things. I remember I was signed as an S form by Alec Miller at Hibernian Football Club, and he gave me a very good piece of advice early on. Though he said that this is the first rung on the ladder of signing an S form, a schoolboy form. He said, stick in at school, stick in at education, and see where the game takes you. And the one thing I've kind of learned, maybe the hard way to an extent, because you get disappointment if you're released from a club, and it happened for me. I got to a Reserve League Cup final, which was probably my high point playing football at senior level with Hamilton, and within a short time after that, I was released from it. And you can take it as a young player, as a young person, you can take it quite hard to heart, but it's a learning experience. And everything is an experience in life, and certainly that's the case in football. And I can now look back fondly on great times that I had playing the game and being just in love with playing football as a young player. And it's something I think when you're involved in the football industry, you have to have that infection for the game. You have to. It's an infectious kind of feeling to watch football or play football, and hopefully that comes across in terms of whenever I kind of talk about the game.
Absolutely, and as you say, you need that passion, you need that love. So let's get right into it. How did that role that you alluded to just there in the Scottish Football Museum, how did that all transpire?
I was working in a call centre of all things at the time. I just left university, just kind of getting on to really starting to work and getting some money and things like that, and just trying to work out what I was going to do with my career. I was a history graduate, but there wasn't a lot of jobs out there at the time, certainly. If you were a history graduate wanting to pursue, that particular area, that discipline. And out of the blue, I always remember Herald newspaper advert for a researcher post with the new Scottish Football Museum. The museum itself it's the first in Europe, it's the oldest in Europe, and that gives you an idea about how important football is in Scotland. That we're long ahead of Germany, France, England, etc. when it comes to setting up a museum. It'd been set up in 1994, but it was really kind of linked into the development of Hampden. So originally it was the Museum of Transport for a few years, and they needed to get researchers in because they needed to research the history galleries. There wasn't a perfect history of Scottish football. A lot of the subject wasn't really widely known, and we needed to get people in to start to kind of piece together, I suppose, what we wanted to talk about within the new museum. So I was invited for interview, but I always remember it was a full year. I applied for it, never heard anything, and for a full year, just assumed that that I was unsuccessful. And I think the funding hadn't come online, even though they initially intended in 1998 to start the researchers. And I always remember a full year later, out of the blue, still working in the same call centre at the time, and getting the phone call to say, "Would you like to come to the interview?" And I bit their hand off. Was lucky enough, went to Park Gardens for the interview and was successful, and I've been here ever since.
When you first went into the role, what was the description? As you say, it's a researcher, but what exactly were you there to do?
There was a number of areas that they wanted me to do because I did have a bit of a background in football, having played the game to I'd actually, believe it or not, I'd played as well as reserve team level in the senior grade. I'd played junior football, but I'd also played briefly Highland League, so it was quite a good
Right.
sale that I could talk about different parts of Scotland. I spent 2 months playing Highland League football with Fort William, and going up to Inverness, Thistle, and places like that. So I had quite a good CV in that respect, just as a young lad getting in to do some research, and so I had a number of areas. We needed to get engaged with the clubs, all the senior clubs across Scotland. We wanted to have a clubs gallery, so we needed someone to go out and just meet the club historians, find out more about the club, and try and find out more about potential objects that could be loaned for display. So that was one quite important area. We all it was a big job, and quite a number of us were involved in that. The other researchers as well at the time. Another area was technical football, so looking at things like training, injuries, looking at how football players look after themselves or should look after themselves on and off the field. So I actually remember visiting the Celtic club doctor at the time, just to kind of do an interview with him to ask questions about how players were kind of treated for injuries, but also the prevention of injuries and all the kind of measures that were put in place, at elite level in the game. Another big area, which was only for a short period of time, but has stuck with me ever since, was we were hoping to do an early gallery which looked at the origins of football. So the story in our museum starts in 1867 officially, when Queen's Park Football Club, the first association club that was formed in Glasgow. And we didn't know too much more about the early history of the game up until Queen's Park being formed. And it's a story that goes back hundreds of years. So we did plan to have a history gallery on the origins, but we just ran out of really time, and there wasn't any history books out there. Very few people were researching it seriously, one or two academics and a few others. And so after a few months of that, we had to get to the business just getting the museum open. And so that was dropped as a subject matter, but it's stuck in the back of my head, to be honest. And 22 years on, I'm still researching it in a personal capacity, as a hobby.
Absolutely. Well, we'll get to that later. What sort of memorabilia are we talking about here? This is what I'm into. What have you managed to get your hands on?
Well, discoveries is always the great thing, and we're very lucky being in this part of the world in terms of our place in the world when it comes to football, because the Scottish FA is one of the oldest national associations in the world, and a lot of our clubs are amongst the oldest in the world as well. And I mean, every other day when I'm in the museum, I walk past the original Scottish Cup. It's the oldest trophy globally for association football. The FA Cup's older as a tournament. It's 2 years older than the Scottish Cup, but the original FA Cup was stolen back in 1895. Aston Villa won the trophy back in that year. And what you did then is, because a lot of fans wanted to see the trophy, you actually put it on display in a shop window for everybody to see in the city that you operated from. So overnight, out of a shop window, the FA Cup, the oldest trophy in world football, was stolen and lost and gone forever in 1895. The Scottish Cup then became the oldest, and it's a wonderful thing. It's a direct connection to the very pioneering start of the game. The first Scottish Cup final was 1874. People like Andrew Watson, the world's first black international player, who played in 1881, he won the Scottish Cup, I think, 3 times with Queen's Park. He was given the trophy in he was a captain of Queen's Park and was given the trophy, presented it to him, and that trophy is a link to the very early beginnings of the game, and it brings you right up to to where we are now. It's still very much alive. It's the most important cup competition in Scotland. So it's things like that are fantastic. But people sometimes ask me, what's your favourite objects? And that's definitely one of them, the Scottish Cup. One other item isn't actually in display in our museum. It's in another museum, but it's a medieval football. It dates from the reign of Mary Queen of Scots, so roughly from about 1540. It was discovered in Stirling Castle back in, I think, the early 1980s. At first, it went to the museum, the Stirling Smith Museum, and it's still there. That's the local museum for the castle. And at first, they didn't know what to really refer to it as, and they just put it under leather goods and put it into a store for many years. And it was only maybe in the past 15, 20 years or so, we started to realise its importance, that it is a football. And by a country mile, it's the oldest of its kind in the world. And again, this gives you an idea about the importance of our history and heritage. Sometimes you need people from out with Scotland to come tap you on the shoulder and say, by the way, that's unbelievable what you've got there. And what I remember was a fantastic night in Hamburg in 2006. Germany were hosting the World Cup. The Scottish Football Museum had been approached to help a big museum in Hamburg to host a FIFA World Cup exhibition. We were brought in because we had a knowledge of football. The museum itself didn't specialise in sport. And they then started asking us, what can you bring from Scotland, out of interest, as well as helping with other countries? What can you actually bring to the table? And we mentioned the football from Stirling, the medieval football, and they were absolutely blown away by it. And out of there was 77 countries represented, I think, at the World Cup exhibition that year. In fact, 177 countries represented in some way at that exhibition. And by a country mile, that was the most important exhibit that they had. And the very opening night, they had 4 speeches that were made. And the first speech was by the mayor of Hamburg. Then after that, a guy called Gianni Rivera. He was a major Italian politician, but he was also a fantastic footballer in his day. And he'd been a World Cup finalist with Italy against Brazil in 1970, the famous World Cup in 1970. And he gave a great speech. It was then the president of the Scottish FA, John Macbeth at the time, gave a speech because of the importance of what we brought to the table in terms of the various exhibits that we brought to Hamburg that day. And the final speech was made by the Provost of Stirling because of the importance of the ball. So out of 177 countries, 4 speakers, 2 were from Scotland. And what happened then, and I didn't know this, was a complete surprise. What then happened to officially open the exhibition? This took place in a marquee tent outside the main museum. The museum is a bit smaller than Kelvin Grove, but not much smaller. It was in that kind of standing. And what I remember was just as the speeches had been finished, all these guests, 200 people from across the world, had been invited to the launch, and the doors open for the guests to actually walk into the museum to see the exhibition for the first time. And just before that happened, they brought out the ball, the medieval football, on this pillow, and the Hamburg Pipe Band then came in from somewhere out with the main tent. I didn't even know Hamburg had a pipe band. They didn't even told me that they were going to be playing at this. And they actually piped the medieval football from Stirling Castle into the museum, and all the 200 delegates came in a procession behind the bagpipes and the ball getting moved in. You would have thought that night Scotland had won the World Cup, and we weren't even there at the World Cup in 2006. So that's one of the best nights I had. But that ball in particular, it's one of the ones I've been lucky to I've held the Champions League trophy and looked after. I've looked after the UEFA Cup, when these events came to Hampden in 2002, I think 2007. But that ball, I've held it a few times, and it's the one thing for me that gives me the shivers still when I'm asked to hold the ball, because it's just something that isn't anywhere else in world football, to have something that old, the links to the origins of the game.
You're talking about you generally just need a minute there to take all that in. You're talking about how well respected these like you say, at a World Cup Scotland aren't even at, that how, look at us, wow, like we're holding this ball. Do you think there's almost like is there an arrogance amongst us that we're not aware of how influential we actually are in the worldwide state of play at football?
I think it's been over maybe the last 20 years or so that we're starting to realise a lot more now about the role that Scotland has had in terms of the development of the game. We talk quite a lot in the museum about the importance of Queen's Park, not just within Scottish football and setting up the game in Scotland. They were very instrumental at a very early period. But also just the way the game that was played, because when Queen's Park were formed in 1867, they didn't have anybody else to play against for a whole year. And then eventually they find someone else that's willing to play them at association football. It was a team called Thistle FC. They were based in Glasgow Green. Queen's Park were based in the recreation ground at Queen's Park, the public park. And they play at Queen's Park. The game was 20 aside. It was 2 hours. There were no goalkeepers. Touchdowns were awarded. So basically, if the ball went wide of the goals, it was still in play. So it might be behind the goals, but you were still allowed to go for the ball. And if the defending player got his hand onto the ball first, he was allowed to kick the ball back into the field from where it left the field of play. But if the attacking player got his hand onto the ball first, a touchdown was awarded. And if the game ended in no goals, they counted the number of touchdowns and that determined the winner. That was association football. It was a very, very different game from what we know today. And Queen's Park helps to change that. The game starts to go to 11-a-side by the time of the first international, Scotland v England in 1872, which took place at Partick in the West End of Glasgow. Queen's Park organised that game and provided all the players. The Scotland team was basically Queen's Park FC against England. It ended in a draw, but the style of game was very different. The English played a dribbling game based around prowess, physical, very, very much a physical game. Players were skillful dribbling the ball, but also kicked long and gave chase. The Queen's Park players playing for Scotland knew they couldn't basically match up to England man for man, because they would be knocked to the ground in a heavy but fair challenge from the rules at the time. And so they played a short passing game. They played in pairs and worked together in pairs to take the England player off the ball in a challenge. The first player might get knocked to the ground, but his teammate would then nick in and steal the ball. And moving forward, when just as a Queen's Park player or a Scotland player playing that match was about to be tackled from a challenge, he played a short pass to the side, and as he looked up, having been challenged by the England player, he saw his teammate running on with the ball. Very, very basic tactics, rudimentary tactics by today's standards, but it revolutionised football. So in terms of the influence that Scotland has had, it's quite an incredible influence. It's a different thing though, telling that and not sounding gallus or arrogant. It's just trying to stand up sometimes and say, well, we have a story to tell here. And that exhibition in Hamburg allowed us to do it, because it was called Fascination Football, and it gave everybody that had a story to tell, and that included China. The first recorded evidence of football in the world, or a form of football, is China, 200 BC. A game called Two or Two Kick was the name they called it. In Italy, in the 1500s, they were playing a form of football called Calcio in Florence. So everybody got an opportunity to stand up there, and there was a strong section on England's role as well. I know that because I helped to do that exhibition for them. And then there was obviously we did a lot of strong work on Scotland's story, including the short passing game and how it transformed football, talking about the medieval football and all that kind of stuff as well. So from that, yeah, we have a very strong story to tell. If you don't shout, people don't hear you. And there is a view of how the game for decades. There's a view about how football tended to have developed over the last 150, 170 years. And a lot of the early histories didn't really reflect on that influence that Scotland had, and so that's why we do sometimes need to shout a little bit to kind of get our views across.
Absolutely, and I was going to touch on it later when we're talking about, like you say, all the work you're doing yourself, and we will come to that, but I just feel right now is quite an appropriate time to ask, how do you feel in the sense that how much, especially nowadays, and you hear all the chants, and I think there's the Netflix documentary out as well, that it's so much it's England's game, it's the British game, or I can't even think what that Netflix documentary is called right now, but there's loads of claims in, oh no, it's our game. But how does it make you feel, who's got such a wide range and such a deep sense of knowledge? How do you...
The Netflix documentary, I think it's called The English Game.
Yeah.
And the great irony that two of the important characters in that Netflix documentary are Scottish. Lord Kinnaird, who was president of the FA from, I think, 1890 to 1922 or 23. It was about the time of Wembley opening. He finally died, and he held the position of president of the FA in England for all that period of time. I think he was a committee member from 1867 with the FA, but he was from Perthshire. He was from Rossley Priory. That's the family home in Perthshire. He played association football in London for leading teams in London at the time, and played for Scotland in the second international match of 1873 against England. The other player was, I think it might have been Fergie Souter, who is connected to Darwin FC and then Blackburn Rovers FC. And he was one of the Scotch professors, a term that was given to Scottish players crossing the border to get paid to play for football. At a time when the game was still amateur in Scotland, the game was turning professional in England. A lot of the early committee members in the FA didn't like it. They wanted it to remain an amateur game. It was a game for gentlemen players. But it was becoming a working class game in England, in the Midlands and the north of England in particular. And that's where the world's first football league was formed in 1888, also by a Scotsman, William McGregor. So that's the interesting thing, that one example gives you, the story of the English game. Yet you've got 2, maybe 3 Scottish people very prominent within that story. And in McGregor's case, certainly in terms of the creation of the Football League, he was the guy who was chairman of Aston Villa. And Aston Villa, actually, the club that he was chairman of, you'll see the lion rampant on their chest that they wear in their badge. That's because the early pioneers at Aston Villa were Scottish, and they chose the emblem of Scotland, Scottish identity, although they were based down in Birmingham, playing for this new club. That's the Scottish origins in Aston Villa. It can be seen on the line rampant that they wear in shirts to this day.
Wow. And I've honestly never even made that connection. Just touching back on something you said before as well. You talked about that you've been in possession of UEFA Cup, the Champions League, and that's obviously when these tournaments come to Hampden, come to Scotland. What's it like at the Buzz right now? Obviously, as well, we've got the Euros coming to Hampden. What's it like? As again, you're getting to hold these trophies, these original trophies. The inner wee boy must come out.
Yeah, the Champions League final in 2002 was a big one because I joined the museum in 1999, so I was 3 years in post, working with the museum, and that was a massive event, obviously, and Real Madrid coming with Zidane and Roberto Carlos, and a brilliant Leverkusen side as well. Lucio, Brazilian World Cup player as well, and that team, Ballack, the German internationalist. Fantastic teams, and to be involved in something like that was absolutely special. So they don't come along that often, I would say for me, in terms of these really big games beyond the cup finals that we have in Hampden, which are still very important and special in their own right, but in terms of the European level games, that this tournament is going to be something very different because it's not a final in itself. It's part of a broader tournament, so we won't have the trophy here or anything like that. We won't be involved in that respect, but it's something very much to look forward to, particularly because of COVID. COVID really, unfortunately, will play a big role in the tournament, in a negative way, in the fact that we'd hope to have, capacity crowds at Hampden and at Wembley and, in Munich and these other places. And it's really sad that obviously the Aviva Stadium in Dublin isn't going to be a venue now, because that we've been involved briefly with some of the guys that were kind of involved with the Dublin project as well. And it was quite excited for them about that happening. It's a real shame that that's not going to happen. But that being said, as we come out of lockdown, football is something, and I think a lot of fans out there will agree with us. It keeps you going. It's not the same when you don't have crowds in the stadium. I know that the atmosphere is not the same, but my goodness, it's better having a game of football to watch, at least even from home, than nothing at all. And obviously from our point of view, the one big thing has been the men's national team. After a very long time, I think 1998 was the last time we qualified. They finally qualified, and it's brilliant. At least that we'll have some fans in the stadium as the men's national team to take to the world stage again in a very big way for the first time in such a long period of time.
Absolutely. It is fantastic, and I've said it time and time again, it's going to be my first tournament that Scotland even reached, so it's fantastic for the guys. Just again, before we move on to, like I say, I'm so interested in all the work that you're doing on your own back, but so during this period of time, that you've been at the museum, the Champions Leagues and so on, what are your standout moments along your career?
The Champions League jumps out just because of it was early on in my career working for the museum, and there's only been one Champions League final in Scotland, I suppose, in that respect. So because of the size now of venues at the moment, we're not going to get one probably in the near future. So that was particularly special. We did look after the trophy, and I always remember working absolutely solid for a full week in the build up to the tournament. We had hundreds of people. We're still able to have the museum open up until a couple of days before the match itself. That's changed now with UEFA requirements for the tournaments. But back then we were open. We're doing stadium tours, and we were absolutely overwhelmed with just people so excited to be inside the stadium, so close to a major tournament. The trophy was on display, the Champions League trophy as well. And one of my responsibilities was for the handling and movement of the trophy up until the day of the game. And I remember taking it to Kelvin Grove Museum. There was a big formal dinner there with UEFA and with the various clubs involved in that as well, and just I remember seeing Michel Platini going out for a cigarette, really senior member at UEFA, standing outside, about 1 o'clock in the morning as we were taking the trophy to take it back to the stadium the day before the big match. So that for me was, you kind of really, we hadn't seen anything on that kind of scale before, in terms of just what comes, what's involved in these kind of events, and what UEFA bring to the show, I suppose. So that still was amazing. The UEFA Cup final wasn't as big an affair as the Champions League final. It was 5 years later, but it was still a really big affair. And the strange one for that one was there's very strict protocol for these games. And again, the museum buddied up with and the Scottish FA staff buddy up with UEFA for all different aspects of a tournament, hosting a big final like that. So you get like the local organising kind of team. And so I was brought in alongside a chap from UEFA to be responsible for just moving the trophy and getting it ready for obviously going out onto the plinth for presenting it to the winning team. And that it was just great fun kind of to be involved in that. But it was also quite a surreal experience as well. I'm just trying to think with the trophy at the time. One of the things I always remember was you meticulously plan for a major event like that. So you've got basically almost like a manual, and second by second, minute by minute, what happens and when. From when the referee picks up the ball as he walks out to when the game goes live with the cameras, to presentation protocols for when the teams get called up. The losing team come up first. They don't, they're quite sad. They don't want to be there. But you've got to get them up, get them the medals, empathise with them, get them off, and then get the referees and the winners up. So all this is very, very carefully determined and timed. And you've got this packed stadium, UEFA Cup final, and you've got I think it was then the Crown Prince, Prince Felipe. He's now King of Spain, but he was a kind of guest of honour because it was an all Spanish final. It was Espanyol versus Seville, and he was up in the VIP section in Hampden. And very last minute, he decided, I want to come down and actually shake the hands of the players. This hadn't been decided, and the panic. The initial panic that you get, because it's like this, it's just tear up the book. And it might seem like a simple thing, that this is, just someone coming down to be part of the kind of, alongside Michel Platini and the other people in the entourage that are going to be commiserating with the losing team and celebrating, I suppose, the winning team and kind of shaking hands and all that kind of stuff. But it's a head of state, and it was a whole different level. And I just remember, just briefly, very hugely professional show. But I just very briefly remember when that decision came in last minute, just off the cuff. The Crown Prince would like to come down, and everybody just temporarily was a wee bit worried with that. But it went well, and it was just again, we've been lucky with these finals. We always seem to get tend to get a fairly decent game. And 2002, one of the best games I've ever seen live. But even 2007 as well, the UEFA Cup final as well. It was a great match as well. Two teams really going out to try and win the game.
I know you say there's an element of enjoyment, but you must be absolutely kicking it, to put it politely, when you're holding these trophies. Like that pressure, you hear all of this, like you say, there's the original FA Cup getting lost in Villa's possession. Do you not think, oh my God, I could be the one to drop this?
The good thing is, we know the ground well at Hampden, and again, I've been very lucky in that working at the stadium. When it's, say, Scottish Cup final, for example, which we do that year in, year out, so we've been quite fortunate normally that everybody knows the place, we know the stadium inside out, etc. The test sometimes comes when you're doing something a bit different, and this year, obviously, last year when Celtic won the Scottish Cup to complete the quadruple treble, obviously protocol was different because the players were out on the pitch, etc. And I wasn't involved in that one. It was my colleague, assistant curator, who was normally be two members of staff get involved in supporting these kind of things from the museum. But because of COVID protocols, it was one member of staff. So my colleague, Demi, said she'd be happy to do it, which was great. So it was really on her, but that was quite a different one. She said that afterwards, it wasn't the kind of the nice simple 10-foot walk. You're actually having to walk onto the pitch, etc. And everybody is watching you because it's a procession as you walk onto the field of play, and you could feel the eyes on you at that time. So I've never had that to kind of worry about, but they tend to go okay. But yeah, you just got to kind of keep your mind very much focused on for literally 20, 30 seconds. That's it. Everything else is behind the scenes. If you're working in these events, for us, so that you won't see anything else happening. But yeah, it's maybe the 10 seconds, 20 seconds when the trophy's coming out, and you've then got the cameras on you, I suppose, just to make sure that you keep things sensible, and you just go and do the job that you have to do.
What do you see when you see the players mucking about with the trophy? Do you not think like, oh my God, that's my baby? Like,
there is a worry. It's the oldest trophy in world football. It's getting that balance. It is the oldest trophy in world football. It's an heirloom. It's an heirloom for Scottish football, and it's an heirloom for world football because it's the oldest of its kind, and it's unique. There are replica trophies, obviously, for the Scottish Cup, but they're not the same. They don't replace it. If anything happened to the original trophy, the replica might look like it, but it's not. It wasn't made in the same year as it. It doesn't do the same job in that respect. So there is a concern, I suppose, for that 25-minute period when the trophy is officially handed over. Normally, it's up in the cup presentation area within the stadium. We can hand it over. We put it there on the plinth, and then that's it for 25 minutes. We go down and we outside the dressing room of the winning team as they come in. And yeah, the clubs themselves are professional about it as well. The players are kind of maybe gently, if they don't know about it, reminded or educated that it is a very important and slightly fragile trophy. It's not getting any younger. We do checks on it before and after the match as well, just to make sure that it's fit for purpose moving forward. The last thing we want is that the trophy is retired, full stop. We want it to be a working trophy once every year for cup final day, and that trophy that was presented in 1974 is the trophy that's presented in 2021. We want that to continue. So it's basically, there's an element of risk when it goes out to the players, and that's where the balance. You can't. I was a player myself, not that good to play in a Scottish Cup final or anything like that, but I remember as a young player, to win the trophy, it's a big deal, and you work hard all season, and it's the highlight of your career quite often. The trophies that you win if you're lucky enough to do so. So we've got to be mindful of that as well. That you can't be walking around, with a clipboard to tell them not to do this, not to do that. But the kind of request always is just, to be mindful that it is a very important trophy, not to run into the crowd with it and that kind of stuff, just in case something could go wrong. It's wee things like that you've got to be maybe a wee bit worried about. But to be fair, there's not been really any major issues, that we've had in terms of that side of things. I think the players are just really delighted to have won it. They appreciate its history, and that it's such an important, iconic trophy within the Scottish game. And but we're also happy to get it back, I must admit, when the players come in after the lap of honour. It's always nice to see the trophy back in their possession.
Still in good nick. We'll have it for many years to come, hopefully. Then, yeah.
That's the plan. That's the plan, because there's up until probably I think it was maybe 2001 was when the trophy was first brought into the museum, and we put into that protocol into operation, whereby it's on display for visitors to see, but effectively it's minimal contact with it. And by that I mean basically that when we take it out the cabinet, we have to put white gloves on, cotton gloves for it to move it around, so we're not getting acid from residue from finger marks onto it, and it's cleaned maybe twice a year. Because every time you clean silver, over a long period of time, you thin silver. Yep. You've got to think about that trophy. Up until 2001, it went out to the winning club, and anybody could clean it. The cleaner in the stadium might want to polish it. They might bring a polisher in to clean it as well, but they might use Jeweller's Rouge, which isn't the best thing to use. It makes it look shiny, but over 100 years, it's maybe not the best chemicals to use. So we bring in a museum conservator that cleans it, and it's cleaned effectively twice a year before the cup final to make sure it's presentation ready. And then obviously after the cup final, it's got finger marks all over it, as you would expect, and it's cleaned again. And that minimal contact means that it's fit for purpose for many years to come. So that it is the original trophy that the players get their hands on, when they're successful.
That is fantastic, and as you said, it's all about the originality of it, and as you say, we're delving into the origins of football, and this is when I'm looking forward to this. But talk us through all these major projects that you're doing off your own back, nothing to do with the museum.
Well, working for the museum, I'm very privileged in that you kind of we can do research into a whole manner of areas kind of connected to the game. And that story I told you, I think, at the beginning about being the researcher, and one of my first jobs being the origins of football, that was a bug for me. I just got really interested because I didn't know much about it when I was starting off. And I've got lots of general interest in association football in Scotland, and talking lots of different things, and I can certainly talk about that. But the origin subject, for some reason, just stuck with me, and for the last 20 odd years now, it's been almost 22 years actually. I've been working on basically a database looking at the history of football from the earliest times up to 1873. Because if you want to properly understand the story of football in Scotland, you've got to know where it came from. You've got to properly understand the context of it. And because of the research we've been doing over the last few years, that's why, for example, we can talk about Scotland's role on the world stage in terms of how we helped to develop the game. A story that's largely been untold, and the museum certainly tries to do that. But in terms of the origins, there's some huge milestones coming up. For example, just this year, 2021, it's the 140th anniversary of the world's first women's football match under association rules, and that was in Scotland, in Edinburgh in 1881 at Hibernian Park, first Hibernian Park. Teams representing Scotland and England played a women's football match under association rules. So not just the first in Scotland, not just the first in Europe, that's the first in the world. So there's a first example, and that's in spite of a period of largely discrimination, in fact, institutional discrimination against women's football, from the 19th century, particularly large parts of the 20th century up till really the 1970s, when the Scottish FA recognised football, women's football, for the first time in 1974, but for many years of discrimination. And yet there's so many of these, that's what we call it, the hidden history of Scottish football. So that's one example. There's, I think, the first international match next year is 150 years old. Again, the world's first international, FIFA, the global game, Partick, the West Scotland Cricket Ground in the West End of Glasgow. That's where it happened. That's where the world will be focused on when we celebrate that next year. The Scottish Cup first final will be 150 years old in 2024. That's also the 600th anniversary of Scottish football, because the first recorded evidence of football in Scotland was in 1424, an Act of Parliament by King James I banning football because it was so popular. It was interfering with archery practice and getting his men ready for combat.
Way.
So that's the first recorded evidence, and that will be 600 years to the day, I think in May, if I remember, 2024. So the Scottish Cup will be 150. Scottish football will be 600 years old, and the world's first football club, which was formed in Edinburgh in 1824, that will officially be 200 years old. So you can see there's all these milestones coming up. Another one a wee bit later on is 2028, and that will be officially 400 years of women playing football in Scotland. The first recorded evidence is in 1628 in the village green at Carstairs in Lanarkshire, and it was a minister really upset because it took place on the Sabbath, on the Sunday. And the kind of pre-Reformation church, they were quite strict in trying to keep the Sabbath a very solemn occasion where you didn't really come out and enjoy yourself and celebrate things and play sport. And so because this game took place, and it was men and women together playing football in 1628, that's the first recorded evidence of women playing football, not only in Scotland, anywhere in Europe. So again, that's a big milestone, which we celebrated the 390th anniversary back in 2018, but I thought we had a far bigger celebration when it comes to 400. So all this has happened, all these big milestones are happening within a period of a few years. And so for me, it was really looking at ways in which we could really properly celebrate this, and the museum certainly will do its best as well to tell a lot of these stories. But in terms of the origins of football, an area that we don't have a lot of coverage in, I wanted to do that just as a personal research subject. And there's some incredible stories. It's 4,500 individual references to football up to 1873 that I've got now, and I'm still adding to it. And there's lots of different really fascinating kind of facts within that.
How do you this is sheer arrogance as well, but I was under the impression, as many, that Queen's Park, that's the start of football, that's the start of Scottish football, that's it. But that is decades and hundreds of years before. Like, how do you come across all of this sort of research?
Over a period of time, I suppose. There were some, very early on, there were some academics and one or two articles that had been published by academics that kind of touched upon it. But it's just years of sitting in libraries initially. I've been to the National Library of Scotland so many times I can't remember. I can even tell you, to the nearest dozen how many times I've been there, going through archives, National Records of Scotland, National Library of Scotland, Glasgow University Special Collections, libraries across Scotland from Dumfries to Perth, some brilliant stuff actually in Perth from the 1600s, 1700s to do with crafts guilds, looking at the importance of football within the Perth community at that particular time. So just you speak to people that have a similar interest as well, and you can learn from them, and they learn from you as well. And just over a long period of time, and we're lucky now, we're in a digital age. So now newspapers, you can easily now, for a subscription, I think £70 a year, you can subscribe and get access to lots of local newspapers in Scotland and national newspapers. And that's actually accounted for an awful lot in the last maybe 5 or 6 years of the 4,500 references that I've got. I would probably say that over the first maybe 200-300 years, you might have 500 references. But from the 1800s, 1840s onwards, you've got thousands of references because the newspapers start to become very commonplace and mass-produced. And so you get a lot of kind of references to football, from the 1830s, 1840s onwards. So a lot of it will be looking at that kind of Victorian age, I suppose, in terms of the research. But certainly it goes back to the 15th century in terms of some of the earliest references. Bizarre one, St Andrews University, actually, they had a code of conduct for their university students, St Leonard's College, and St Leonard's College was set up for kind of poor students. So it was for not the kind of wealthy, but for students maybe from a lower income to still give them an education if they had potential. But I actually banned them from going out at night for like you students would do, go out and maybe have a good time and go to the pub, whatever. They were banned from doing that. They were banned from wearing certain clothes. They were banned from playing football, and they were also banned from carrying knives, which was quite maybe interesting. But that's the way society was back in the 16th century. So there's all these kind of weird and wonderful references to the game, involving all sorts of people, different walks of life as well. And for me, that's my mission, I suppose, is certainly by 2023 to have this database published and ready for people really to see and to hopefully kind of learn something from it as well.
For a bit of a taster, what are perhaps 2 or 3 maybe the starkest and most surprising pieces of origin or stories that you've came across that you never knew about and maybe nobody else really would as well?
Sometimes we're told that football started on a certain day at a certain time, and the way I look at it as I kind of look at it as a process of evolution, not revolution. So people say, well, 1863, the FA's formed in London, and the first rules are drawn up. Now that's very important for association football. Of course, it's very much a major milestone. But you've also got the first international match taking place. The first official one was in Scotland in 1872. You've got the start of league football. Prior to 1888 in England, league football didn't exist. So players, it was just friendly matches that were quite often played. So you've got all these tiers of the development of the game. And what I would always say is, well, how did the FA start? Who started it? Well, it was football clubs. The early football clubs in and around the London area came together because they couldn't agree on the same playing rules. They all had their own ways of playing football, their own idea how to play football, their own individual rules, playing rules. So the idea was to create a uniform set of rules. So there's your first building block, is football clubs. Where was the first football club formed? Edinburgh, 1824. So wherever you want to start this is where the game started. You can start at 1863 or 1872 or 1824 for the first club. In terms of the origins, though, what I find really interesting is people refer to the game in the 19th century as being elitist initially. Eventually becomes a working class game, as the big professional clubs start to take over in towns and cities across Scotland, England and elsewhere, etc. But originally they talk about it being an elitist game, an amateur game, played by young gentlemen players in London. So the early clubs in London were the Auditorians after Eton School, the Old Harrovians, which was Harrow School, very elite public schools, universities as well had a major role. And that's true, all part of the story. But I can go back to the 1840s and 1850s in Scotland, and I can get football clubs playing who were made up of Irish navvies, for example. There were the first, going a little bit later actually, 1868, when the first football clubs to play association rules in Scotland was an Irish club called Airdrie Football Club, not the current Airdrieonians, but Airdrie, they were just called Airdrie Football Club, formed in 1868. They played Queen's Park in 1870, and that was an Irish club, although they weren't called Shamrock or Harp, which many clubs were at the time, that they were created by people from Ireland coming over to play football and to live here. They were actually probably the first association club that was one of the first Irish clubs, even before Hibernian Football Club in Edinburgh. But there's a great one. I think I mentioned Queen's Park's first match, 1868, 20 aside and all that. you go back to 1853 in Perth, and it's Irish and basically Irish immigrants living and working in Perth, playing football in Perth, playing 20 aside, and they actually got stones and put stones down to create the goals on the field in Perth. And for me, the very interesting thing about this is the idea of the creation of rules and playing rules. Everybody comes to all the clubs when they're formed, all have their own ideas, and they all have to come together and compromise. And that's what happens in the FA in London. It happens in Scotland as well, separately in other areas. Queen's Park had to agree with Airdrie over what rules to play. Airdrie, because it was people coming from Ireland, they would have their own idea about how to play football, and they brought those ideas to Scotland. And that's why when you look at obviously, and you've still got very strong the GAA in Ireland, and you've got Gaelic football, which is massively strong still at Croke Park is a major kind of centre point for the games there. But it's very arrogant for us to think that in Scotland, that we invented football and it was purely a Scottish game. There were people from across Scotland, not just Glasgow. Glasgow's the epicentre because that's where Queen's Park start to kind of generate the major kind of move towards association football. But the early clubs that they play against, one's Drummond Football Club. Drummond is a kind of clan name, Clan Drummond, and it was called Drummond because the guys that played for that team were from Perthshire in Stirlingshire, and that's where Clan Drummond is seated. And when they played Queen's Park in one of the first matches, 1870, they wore caps on their heads. The cap is now a presentation gift. You get cap for your country if you play for Scotland, but originally it was a part of the uniform. And the Drummond players wore the Drummond tartan. So they're straight away isn't a Glasgow team. It's a team in Glasgow, but they're from Perthshire. And they played football in Perthshire before they played association football. I've got evidence of that to show that the games have been played there. So people coming over from Ireland as well started to play football matches, also had their own idea about playing football. And so a compromise had to happen. So the early matches with Queen's Park, they're sitting down with the secretary of our team and saying, right, guys, we play the fair catch, so you're allowed to catch the ball out of the air and pull it into your chest. That was an early Queen's Park tactic, part of the laws of the game. And the Airdrie club would have maybe a different view on that, whether to play it or not to play it, and they had to compromise over it. And eventually when the Scottish FA is formed, then you have a kind of a formal uniform set of rules, which helps the game then to kind of expand kind of massively. But when it comes to the origins of the game, there's so many voices in the subject. It isn't one or even a small group of very elite people coming together and telling us that this is how football was invented, that we set it up. It was dying a death in the early 19th century, and we saved it for the world. That's traditionally what we were told. But actually, now we know from a lot of the research now that there's a far bigger, wider story to it. That's only one part of a far bigger jigsaw puzzle.
As you say, it was, you touched upon there, obviously, the Irish Airdrie. But and it was the same in reverse as well. Scots going abroad and migrating and immigrating and having that influence all over, wasn't
it? Yeah, it's an interesting thing because what I find quite interesting in the early years of association football. So we get into the 1870s. You get the formation of the Burning Football Club. First of all, you've got Harp up in Dundee as well, quite early on. But you can actually look at, if you bring out a Scottish Athletic annual newspaper from the 1880s period, and you flick through it, it's incredible the number of Irish teams in Scotland because of the levels of Irish immigration into Scotland, over decades leading up to the 1880s period. And so you can just look at the names and you see the symbolism, and it's a natural thing that you do. You leave home. There's push and pull factors, for leaving home. Obviously, in Ireland, the famine was absolutely horrific and huge, and there was more than one famine as well. And people had to kind of flee the country to kind of survive. And then obviously the big cities like Glasgow, the big industrial cities, starting to expand in size and really sucking in people because they needed employment, people to work in the factories, not just Irish immigration, but also across Scotland. That's what I mentioned, the Drummond Club. That's people from the north, further to the north of Scotland. Even Queen's Park FC, when they were formed, the early members of Queen's Park were actually from the north of Scotland, from Murray and from Aberdeenshire. So all these people kind of get sucked into the big cities to live and to work, and they obviously want to play football. But there is an element of identity. So the Drummond Club, they've got their identity of their homeland, which is Perthshire and Drummond Tartan, and so you can see that there straight away. from an Irish probably immigration perspective into Scotland, when they start playing association football, not Airdrie FC, although they were an Irish club, but certainly for a lot of the other clubs that were founded by Irish immigrants, they look back home to their homeland and they look to national symbols of their homeland. So it's the harp. So Hibernian originally were called Hibernian, which is obviously the Irish name the Roman name for Ireland, but they also would wear the harp. Harp of Dundee, that's in their name. It's the national emblem of Ireland. You've got Shamrock, and you can actually look at small towns. It's not even just the big cities. It's small and medium-sized and larger towns would have Irish clubs, and it's quite a significant number. What happened in the back of that was there was criticism. If I remember correctly as well, Hibs for the first year weren't even admitted into the FA because they were seen as an Irish club. They weren't a Scottish club in that respect. So there was an element of discrimination happening at that time. And after a year, with actually other clubs around Hibs basically saying, this is ridiculous, Hibs should be in the association there. They're finally admitted. But what I find interesting about that is I've told the story about Scotland's influence, and it's a global influence because not just in terms of shaping the way the game's played, the short passing games we refer to at Queen's Park were instrumental in setting up. People from Scotland travelled throughout the world. Obviously, there was the Empire at that particular time, and people in Scotland, an incredible number of people were travelling across the world throughout the Empire, but also to other places like North America and places like South America as well, which is referred to as the informal empire. Huge investment in South America, particularly in the railway infrastructure of South America. And you actually see a lot of the early pioneers in South America from Scotland were engineers from Glasgow working the railways. So there's quite a lot of really kind of connections there. The reason I mention all this is because Scots are going across the world, and the first thing they do when they arrive in another part of the world, whether it's Buenos Aires or it's New York, they first of all try and find out fellow-minded people like them that came from the same part of the world that they came from. They set up Burns clubs and St Andrews societies, and when it comes to football, they set up their own football clubs. So in Sao Paulo, there's a club playing in the top flight of Brazilian football in Sao Paulo, the state of Sao Paulo, called Scottish Wanderers. And they're playing against Santos, and Pelé played for Santos many years later. But there was a textile factory in Sao Paulo that was had a sister factory in Paisley. Paisley, very famous for the textile industry, and so some of the engineers go over to Sao Paulo. Once they arrive there, they want to play football. What are we going to call ourselves? Well, what would you think? Scottish Wanderers, and they had the Scottish line rampant on their chest. And Buenos Aires, really interesting enough, the first ever league championship, I think about 1890 or 1891, went to a playoff match, the first ever league championship of Buenos Aires, of Argentine football. And the playoff was between St Andrews FC and the Old Caledonians to play for the first Argentine championship. Two teams of Scottish immigrants in Argentina playing for the first Argentine championship. In New York, it's Thistle FC. But you can go around large parts of the world where you see a Scottish congregation of people, and it's all about identity. It's remembering the workplace you come from and celebrating it, and it's celebrated through football clubs as well as through Burns clubs and St Andrews clubs and all that kind of stuff as well. The was like us kind of, I suppose, attitude. But the reason I mention that is it's the interesting kind of comparison to what's happening in Scotland. To, there's a bit of hypocrisy, I suppose, from the point of view of Irish immigration coming in at that time, football being a major recreation area of recreation. It was the only game by the 1880s, or not the only game, but the biggest game as it entered into towards the professional age in Scotland as well as an industry in its own right, and everybody really, working classes in particular, was a working class game, flocked to playing football. Glasgow is incredible. It's a soccer centre of the universe. It really is. And from the 1880s right through to really into the 1900s, the three biggest stadiums in the world prior to the First World War, the three biggest purpose-built football stadiums, I should say, for football was Glasgow. It was Celtic Park, Ibrox Park and Hampden. And that gives you an idea about the kind of importance of Glasgow as a city for football. There wasn't anything like Glasgow during that period from the 1880s through to the early 1900s. that could compare to Glasgow. And arguably you could say even beyond that, because Hampden was 1937 was at its biggest, and officially in 1937 Hampden could hold 183,000. I think 724 was the holding capacity for 183,000. Dundee today is a population of about 136,000. So, and we actually looked at the capacity of Hampden as well, not just of Hampden itself, but of the other senior grounds in Scotland. There were 6 senior grounds in Scotland. 6 senior grounds in Glasgow in the 1930s. So you've got Ibrox, you get Shawfield for Clyde, you've got Firhill for Partick Thistle, you've got Celtic Park, you've got Hampden, and you've got Cathkin Park, third Lanarkshall ground. And we actually looked at it, and we did we looked at the holding capacity of those 6 grounds combined. Glasgow had a population of 1 million in the 1930s, and the 6 grounds combined could hold 500,000. 50% of Glasgow's population. There's no other city in the world that comes close to that in terms of that kind of passion for the game at that particular time. And that's not even including the junior grounds, Ashfield, Petershill. Those grounds could hold 20,000-30,000 in their own right as well. So it gives you an idea about what Glasgow was like as a city at that time. It's absolute centre for passion when it comes to football. But there is that, I would say, that wider identity that comes into it as well. And it's fascinating for me, looking into that, the symbolism in football, and looking at Irish identity for football as well in Scotland, as well as then looking at the Scottish experience overseas as well.
Why do you think like this sort of stuff is perhaps maybe lost on us? Like, it's not instilled. It's knowledge that you've had to dig so deep for that. This is outstanding stuff. This should be common knowledge, really.
The tide is changing, and it has been for 20 years. And one dangerous thing is to try and be arrogant about this and say, oh, well, we know this and we know that. This has been a massive effort from lots and lots of different people. There's academics from out with Scotland who are actually doing brilliant research, looking at Scotland's influence and things like that as well. So over time, the early histories were written a very long time ago. A lot of the significant histories were written round about the early 1900s, just as FIFA's been formed. And a lot of the early kind of people who were connected to maybe the game that emerged out of London in the 1860s were still alive and wanting to basically put their stamp on the game's development. And they were looking at it from a period of a lost game, because the early gentlemen footballers, the people that attended the elite schools and the universities that had been very important in football circles in London at that particular time, they were then looking back in the 1900s at a game that was professional, that a game that was working class, that a game, that was played now across whole swathes of England in the north and in the Midlands, as well as in their original enclave. In fact, they've been overtaken in London. The early amateur clubs fell away by the 1880s as professionalism comes in, and Tottenham Hotspur and Arsenal and Fulham and Chelsea, all these clubs, Millwall, start to take over. So they'd have lost that early dominance over the game. The game had moved far beyond them. Professionalism, they didn't want professionalism. Professionalism came in because the working class clubs wanted it. The clubs of the North and the Midlands wanted it. And so they then started to write the history of the game, and they wrote it from their own perspective. And that was then taken as that is the game. And so it's been challenged, not just from a Scottish perspective. You can look at Sheffield FC in a club that was formed in 1857 in its own right, and a really important football culture that sat alongside what was happening in London in the 1860s as well. There's lots of different examples, but for me, one of the great things for me in terms of looking at the kind of Scottish story, and there's a bit more information that's been done recently on it as well. One of my great discoveries are just things that can happen just because you're sitting in an office in a football museum. Years ago, when I was going up to Glasgow University and I was doing all this research, just trying to kind of get more information on the origins, I was also looking at Scotland's influence overseas, and I was actually looking at then a whole host of other materials. I remember coming across a book, and it was of all things on the history of New Millns, which is a small town in Ayrshire, not far from Darvel, quite famous for being part of the textile industry, lace making industry. And the reason why I mention that is they actually were quite pioneering in Sweden and in Spain for football. And at the very back of this book on the history of New Millns village or town, it basically gives you an image of a football club, and it was called Escocese Football Club or Scottish Football Club, and they were based in Barcelona in the late 1890s. Barcelona FC were formed in 1899, so this club actually predates them. And it was a really poor quality picture You could just about make out the players, but it was quite kind of faded and bleached looking, just been photocopied too many times. So you couldn't use it to do anything with it. And I always remembered, I really want to kind of find out more about this, and I want to get a good copy of that. And on and off, years go by, nothing happens. We couldn't find anything on it. And then one day, Monday morning, clicking on my emails, getting my coffee in my hand, and I'm just looking through the emails, and an institution in Catalonia in Barcelona contacted me, and it was basically someone had passed away. They inherited this collection, and we're going through the collection and we're just starting to categorize it into the various sections. And one image came out that they didn't know what to do with, and it basically on the top it says Escocese Football Club, and it was that image, but it wasn't just a bleached, horrible kind of photocopied image. It was an absolutely pristine image of that club. And they thought, you can imagine some researcher thinking, what's this, Scottish Football Club? And maybe did a Google search and find it was a Scottish Football Museum. And that day he sent through a high resolution image of that one team, a team that I said that predates Barcelona at the time. They played against Barcelona during the early years of Barcelona's history. Some of the players who were from New Milns who played in that team actually played for FC Barcelona during the early years of FC Barcelona. So, there's stories like that. And what I'm never surprised now. You don't know what's around the corner. There's more things out there, that we still don't know about. Lots more things, and that's the great fun thing. What's going to happen in 2 weeks' time or a month's time? What story's going to come our way? With all this research that's going on. So brilliant stuff. We'll get brilliant links with Seville as well, the football club there. They found out that they weren't formed in 1905, which they had for many years. They were founded in 1890 by some Scottish guys, one guy from Elgin, one guy, I think, from Glasgow. And it was a Dundee newspaper. They actually came across this. Researchers in Seville researching a Dundee newspaper and finding out about the founders of their club. And now we've got a great, obviously they played in the EFA Cup final and won it at Hampden as well. So there's a brilliant link there. And I think from a Celtic perspective as well, obviously, absolutely, maybe bittersweet memories, but we know what year that was in 2003 as well. So there's all these lovely kind of links now, that we're starting to get as we broaden out, just beyond looking at it from a Scottish perspective.
You do have the best job in the world.
Well, I quite enjoy it, I must admit. It's fun. I'll always say, though, that like anything else, I'm getting to talk about the fun things today, thanks to being part of this interview. But, working in a museum, you've got audits, you've got store management, you've got the other things you have to do as well. And then anybody in the museum will tell you that, there's other elements to it that maybe aren't quite as fun and as the kind of things you might want to talk about. But these things I've been talking about and sharing, that's what really does make it all worthwhile, to be able to do the stuff. And I've been fortunate to have travelled as well through my job as well, and to go to do seminars and things like that, talking about these kind of things as well. So yeah, I must admit, I'm very, very grateful that I've had that position, to be working for the museum. But again, as I said, it definitely demonstrates the importance of this game that we love, not just to us, not just to this country in particular, but actually looking across the world, that people across the world look at us. We might not, I've been to the German National Football Museum, only opened in 2015, and it might not be when you walk into it, you'll see all the World Cups and the European Championships that they've won, and it's very impressive. You see this the Joachim trophies and all that kind of stuff. The amount of times that Germany, one of the big football nations of the world, but you get German fans of football coming into our museum and seeing the early history of the Scottish Cup, the oldest in the world, the medieval football, all these kind of things as well. They're blown away by that as well. So we just got to look at it, from a perspective that, we might not be the biggest nation in the world when it comes to winning competitions, but we've done probably more than most when it comes to actually making it a world game. And, when it comes to heritage, we might not be tripping over World Cups, but there's certainly there's very few other countries that can match us in terms of the national collections that we have in this country and its importance to the world.
Absolutely. And like you say, this is only a snippet. There's just one final point that I'd like to touch back on, purely because I interviewed Shelley Kerr last week, actually, and we were talking about the great strides, obviously, in the women's game. And you mentioned there it's the 140th anniversary. I think you mentioned that's this year. How do you? We sort of spoke about it as well. with all the knowledge you have behind you, you know that the discrimination up until, the 1970s and your Rose Riley's and even her going out to represent Italy instead because it was such a disgrace here. Do you think the magnitude of the achievement that the women make in the last World Cup, obviously the disappointment for the Euros this year, but the World Cup, the attention hasn't quite been there yet, that nobody quite understands just how big an achievement that was?
Without a question, yeah, absolutely. The women's football has come it's gone an incredible journey over the last 20 years. I can remember joining the museum in 1999, and that's just 1 year after the Scottish FA formally took control over the women's national team. Prior to that, it was Scottish Women's Football, which is a very important organisation, and they're doing amazing things. But they were trying to be the national organisation by running women's international matches. And they were doing it on a budget, a very tight budget, without the resources. And from 1998, the women's national team coming under the Scottish FA banner fully, then you see the progress under Vera Pauw initially coming in, and the work that she put in. And obviously, certainly, I've got very fond memories of really working with Anna Signal as we promoted. Anna didn't just run the national team. She had an interest in everything, including the museum and the exhibitions we were putting on, and making sure that women's football, had a good platform within the museum. So the work that she did was remarkable, and it's just brilliant that she got that moment when she took the national team to the first major tournament. And Shelley Kerr as well, then obviously taking this further as well, which has been brilliant. And that's been a lot of hard work. The one thing I can say, the direction of travel is brilliant. There's a long way to go. And if you ask anybody within the women's game, and I'm not within the women's game, I'm an outside observer, but they'll tell you there's still a long way to go. But just even from my experience of standing back and kind of analysing and looking at the direction of the journey, it's been incredible what's been achieved so far. But it's in spite of, as we say, it's historic and institutional discrimination. You go back to the 1920s, and the FA in England quite famously banned women's football, or rather women's football clubs from playing at FA member grounds. So they're basically saying we're not interested. And the Scottish FA don't have a formal ban as such, but they follow the FA lead. And so, for example, you go into the minute books of the Scottish FA from 1924 and I think 1925 from memory. There's four different clubs actually approached the FA for permission to host a women's football match. And each time the Scottish FA, and it's minuted, they actually say, we do not recognise a women's game, permission denied. I mean, it's absolutely stark, and it's right out there. I mean, if it had been anything else, you would be screaming from the rooftops about the levels of discrimination. But that's the way the women's game was treated. And there's some amazing stories. There's one which is kind of watch this space. There's brilliant research that I'm aware of because I'm partly involved in it at the moment. But it's a wee bit under wraps. It's to do with a Scottish team. It's 1920s as well. But within the next few months or so, we're hoping to really promote that. There's a couple of academics are involved in this, and I'd been aware of this particular club, but I've just been absolutely blown away by the storylines now that I'm starting to hear. So I refer to it as the hidden history of Scottish football. Women's football is the hidden history of Scottish football because we, as a museum when we were set up, we are kind of dependent on the institutions that donate to us. So we've got the institutions, the donations from the Scottish FA, the Scottish League, etc., and some of the clubs, etc. If you do not recognise football, women's football, like the Scottish FA didn't up until the 1970s, they're not collecting anything, they're not storing anything to give to the museum when we were created. So there's a huge gap from that Victorian era, 1881, when the first ever match takes place in Edinburgh in the world, right through to really 1970s, and how we'll fill the gaps in. First of all, a lot of the pioneering players from the Rose Riley era have actually donated a lot of material to us, so we're getting stronger from the 60s and 70s era just from personal donations. When you go back earlier than that, there's a bit of a gap there. But what we've done is there's a brilliant a guy called Stuart Gibbs, who's a kind of an artist, and he's also a women's football historian, and he actually has made objects for us because he's an artist. He's actually created artwork. So that the first match of 1881, Scotland v England, and it played in Edinburgh at Hibernian Park. He's done a painting of Lily St Clair, who's the first goal scorer in the history of women's football globally, the first goal scorer for association football. And there's a painting you'll see of her when you come into our museum. So there's ways in which we can get around that, but that is a big thing. It's been the big success story of the last kind of 20, 30 years, at a time when the kind of elite game in Scotland actually has really struggled. You know, you've got clubs getting administration and all that kind of stuff that's happened in the last decade or so. It's getting better now, hopefully, and hopefully the pandemic doesn't create too many problems for the men's game. But yeah, for me, I get excited about it because it's one of these unknown areas. As a researcher, there's still so many. I know there's so much more to come out of that area, the history of women's football, that we don't know about yet. But what we do know about is absolutely phenomenal. So hopefully, you know, in the next few months or so, we'll be able to come back to you and give you some more updates on some brilliant stories that are going to come online quite soon.
Well, I'd absolutely love that. I have had easily one of the best hours. I loved history at school, so I've missed history lessons, and I tell you what, this is a lot more fun than the American Civil War. But thank you so much, honestly, Richard. That was amazing, and I look forward to everything that you're going to unleash. And it's ridiculous what's out there, and the fact that you put in that time and effort. I know I was joking, you have the best job in the world, but I know for an interview, so the sort of research I put into that, never mind trying to find a whole history of a sport. So thank you so much for joining me.
That's great. Thanks for having me again.
Really enjoyed that. Thank you.